This and all talks at the 2020 JavaScript for WordPress conference are brought to you in part by our sponsors Frontity and GoDaddy Pro. Frontity is the easiest way to create performant websites using WordPress and React. It connects both seamlessly so you can focus on building your site instead of all the tooling and configuration. Open source and free to use. GoDaddy Pro Hosting offers a robust suite of free tools to web developers and designers to help them save time managing all their clients and sites. Your free membership also includes advanced 24/7 technical support.
Thank you. I'm Chandrika, and I'm a freelance web developer. I build custom WordPress sites for small businesses. And I'm also the lead developer for Chamber Dashboard plugins, which provide tools to build membership sites for chambers of commerce, business networking, and similar organizations. I've been working with Gutenberg for a while. I've learned to build custom Gutenberg blocks. I've even built some Gutenberg blocks using the ACF, which is awesome. And recently, in the past few months, I've been working on converting all our shortcodes in our Chamber Dashboard plugins into Gutenberg blocks. So today I'm going to talk about one of our shortcode, which is one of our main shortcode, and how I worked on converting that into Gutenberg blocks and what kind of challenges we had to overcome to do the block. So, so why are we on a mission to convert all our shortcodes to blocks? Obviously, because blocks are the future, but also because shortcodes have been around in WordPress for a long time. They give us a simple and easy way to present complex features on the front end. And we've been using shortcodes for plugins, from themes, and they've been around for a long time. But as useful as shortcodes are, unfortunately, they don't give us the nice user interface that Gutenberg blocks can give us. They make it so much more easier to add and remove features on WordPress posts and pages. So we thought all our shortcodes, especially the one shortcode that we started off with, it's a big shortcode. And we thought we'd make it really easy for our users to use the shortcode. And with shortcodes, we've all been there. We have to make an effort to remember all the shortcode attributes. We have to check if they're underscores, if there are dashes, or if the spelling is right. And any of these small mistakes, the shortcode doesn't work. And also, we've been there, all of us have been there, where we are going back and forth between our WordPress site and the documentation to get our shortcodes set up right. So we wanted to help our users avoid all of this. Blocks take away all of this confusion, and they give us a nice user interface where you can just, with the click of a button, you add everything, and all the shortcode attributes that were present earlier in the shortcode are now as part of the block sidebar, where the users know exactly what features are available for them to customize their business directory listings. They can see all of them in one go. They don't have to go back and forth. And the nice thing about Gutenberg is we can also add little help text for the controls, where the users know exactly what that particular feature is going to do. So in view of all this, we thought we're going to start converting blocks. And I think so far we've done 3 or 4 blocks. And this one, the one that I'm going to talk about today, was one of our complex ones too. So when we started thinking about adding blocks to our plugins, there was we had to think about, do we just want to build a new block, or do we just want to convert our existing shortcode into a block? Meaning use the existing shortcode function and build a block on top of the existing function. Converting shortcodes is probably not the right term as of yet, because we're not entirely converting it into a block. Our shortcodes still exist in the plugin, and so do our blocks. So I just used the existing shortcode function that displays all the business listings on the front end, and we built a block on top of the existing function. Um, Instead of building a new block, we chose to use the existing shortcode function. And this doesn't work for all the shortcodes either. I think it depends on each of the shortcode and the output it gives and what it displays on the front end. The decision is based on that. Because for some of our shortcodes, we just built a new function for our block because we wanted to change the output a little bit and give our users more options. But for this particular one, we decided to go with the existing function, mostly because it already has all the functioning code. This one, short code, like I'm about to show you, has a lot of features, like fair bunch of attributes, and each attribute has a few options for the users to choose from. So rewriting all that code over again to build the block obviously didn't make sense to us. And we couldn't remove the shortcode entirely anyway because our current users are using it. And we probably also have users who are not even using the Gutenberg editor yet. They are probably still using the classic editor, which means they're going to be dependent on our shortcodes for a long time. So if we are introducing blocks into our plugins, we need to have both the shortcodes and the blocks running parallelly for a while. So, which also means that if we are having both shortcode and the blocks, when we're updating our plugins, we need to update both of them. We just can't ignore our shortcodes. So using the existing function for both means I have to update it once and my life becomes a lot easier. And the other advantage I found was we wanted to create multiple blocks from one single shortcode. And because I used the same function, using like building two different blocks was like super easy because I didn't have to write any of the PHP part of it. I only had to go build the block part of it, the Gutenberg side, and reusing this helped a lot. So with all of this, so here is the business directory shortcode that I am going to be talking about today. This displays all the business listings on a site. So the users have options to choose what to display with their business listings. The business is a custom post type. It has custom taxonomies like membership levels and categories. And sorry if this image is too small. I couldn't get a better picture. I hope you can see this okay. Because the businesses have custom taxonomies like categories and membership levels. And they also have some custom fields, meta fields like emails and phone numbers, locations, addresses, billing addresses, social media, and a fair bunch of them. So the users, the shortcode gives them options to customize the listings. Basically, they can choose what to display along with their business listings. So with so many options available, our shortcode is huge. So these are all the shortcode attributes that we have. As you can see, we have a fair few attributes, and each one of these attributes has a few options to choose from. So the shortcode function has to take into account all of these options before displaying the output. And I'm so glad I didn't have to rewrite this shortcode functionality. I'm so glad I could reuse it and build my blocks on top of it. And even with that, there were there were a few challenges we had to think about. So before we started building the blocks, I had to go set up our plugins with the JavaScript build. So if we, for all the existing WordPress plugins, if we need to add Gutenberg blocks to it, we need to set up the development environment for Gutenberg. So the tutorial here in the developer handbook or the block editor handbook has really nice step-by-step instructions on how to set up your development environment. I'm not going to go through the details of this because there's other things that I want to talk about. But if you do want to start adding blocks to your plugins, this is a nice starting point. So they have links to other documentation that you need, other help docs, and they have some example code that you can run and test your setup, and a really nice information. So this is a good starting point. And so creating the block is pretty much the same as any other Gutenberg block. You import the necessary dependencies, and this happens in the index.js. Import the dependencies, and then we're using register block type to create the block, just like any other Gutenberg block. So here's my title and the icon, and I have a new custom category for all our Chamber dashboard blocks, because we have a few plugins in our Chamber dashboard suite of plugins. So, and we are planning to convert many of the shortcodes into blocks in the coming months. So all of our blocks will now go in the custom category. And then we have all the attributes. So here is where I had to make sure all the shortcode attributes that we had in the business directory shortcode needed to be added here as the attributes of the block. Essentially, I'm just calling the shortcode function in the PHP callback. So I'm going to be passing all these attributes into my shortcode function. So all my attributes that are in the shortcode had to come as attributes in my block. I'm only showing a few here, but essentially all the attributes that I showed you before have been added here as attributes in my block. And then I have the edit, which is the same. The edit function is in a different file. And the save part, since we are rendering everything in PHP, it returns null. So this is pretty similar to any other Gutenberg block. A couple of things to remember, though, when we're converting the shortcodes to blocks is the name of the attributes need to be exactly what it is in the shortcode, because all of these attributes get passed into our shortcode function. It needs to match, and the type of the attribute needs to be the same as that in the shortcode. If the format is basically the business directory layout, the users can choose to display 2-column, 3-column layouts or a responsive layout. So the format attribute in our shortcode is a string, and so it needs to be a string in the block as well. The default values could be different, and that doesn't matter. In our shortcode, we have the default display format as a list, which means it's a single column layout. But in the block, we decided to do a 3-column layout for the default. So that could be different, but the name and the type need to be exactly the same. And if I'm adding new attributes in my block, which are not part of the shortcode, then I don't have to worry about it. I can do whatever I need to do. But if the attribute comes from the shortcode, the name and the type have to match. And then the next part is the edit, which again, adding the necessary dependencies, and then the inspector controls that go in the edit. Inspector controls is obviously the major part of the block. That is where all our controls go. So all the shortcode attributes that we have in our shortcode were given a control in the inspector controls so that the users can change the values for their business directory listings, like how they want to display their business directories. So, and here is where a lot of decisions had to be taken as well, because not all of the attributes would need similar controls. So depending on which attribute it was, we needed to decide which type of Gutenberg controls we needed to use. And I'll talk about the inspector controls in a little bit. And the other important part inside the edit was the return. So the return part, I used the server-side render so that I could give the users can get a preview of their business directory listings in the block, in the editor. So before they hit publish, they could change all the options, see a preview of how it looks in their editor. So that's the nice advantage of Gutenberg blocks that Shortcodes don't provide us with. So server-side render is really useful that way. And the other thing, so when I'm returning the business directory listings inside my edit, I use the same class, the business list. This is the same class that I'm using for displaying it on the front end. And by adding all my styles in the block editor, I can actually show exactly if the 3-column layout, the users can see it, the listings in the editor, the preview as a 3-column. If they want to change the image size, which which depends on the CSS as well. There are CSS styles based on the image size or the columns. All of those changes can now be seen in the preview as well. So that comes in really handy. And then finally, the PHP callback function, which is actually where the magic happens, because I wrote like with one line of code, all I did was call my shortcode function and pass all the attributes, the block attributes into my shortcode function. And the shortcode function takes care of displaying it both in the editor and in on the front end. So using the existing function means I only have to work on my block attributes. I need to work on the inspector controls, but I really don't have to do much for the PHP part of the block, which is already, we have it existing in our plugin. So that was a really nice part of using the existing shortcode functionality. So now I want to talk a little bit more about the inspector controls and how we made the decisions and what kind of decisions we needed to make for each of our different controls. Obviously, one size fits all doesn't work when it comes to attributes. For the short code, it's easier. You just give them the options to choose from, and they just put in whatever options they need. And there are some default options. So if the user chooses not to put any options, the default option works. Blocks also have default options. So if the user just adds the block and doesn't change anything, it just uses the default options. But how do we give them all these options? How do we decide whether a shortcode attribute needs to be a simple drop down, or does it need to be a toggle button, or does it need to be a checkbox or a range control? So each one depends on the type of attribute we have in the shortcodes and the type of options we had. So for some of these attributes, like the format, where that's the layout of the business directory, or the text where they could choose to display the excerpt or the description. Again, business is a custom post type, so they could choose to display one of these if they wanted to. And they could order by their businesses using by date or menu order or title, or they can display in an ascending or descending order. And for the image, they could choose a featured image or a logo, which is again a custom meta field. So for all these options, what we chose to do for the blocks is give them a simple drop down to choose the options, because these ones only take in one parameter, like one option. You can have multiple options here. So we thought using a simple drop down, giving them the options to choose from would be the easiest way to go. This is not the only way to do it. There are other ways of doing the same directory layout. or giving the same options, but we just chose to do a simple drop down because it's just easier to handle. So we took all these options and I made them into put them in a constant with the label and the values. And the other nice thing again here about Gutenberg blocks is that we can give them user-friendly names. Here we had to do like names that we used in the shortcode functions, but here we don't have to. We can have the values whatever we want that correspond to the values in the shortcode, but we could give them nice user-friendly names that the users actually understand. So we took all these options and put them in a format options variable and pass that into the select control. It's a simple drop down, and when the option changes, the format takes in the new value. This could be done either way. We could either call a function to set the value of the format, or we could just set the attributes, use the set attributes right here inside the select control. Either way works. I just wanted to show you the both are like equally good. So for all the other options like the image and the order by, we did similar drop downs for all those values because it was just one option to choose from. So the other options were not as easy as this one. So we had a few options that had Boolean values. Not really Boolean, but they were as good as those. We had some attributes that take in a value of yes or a no. Essentially, it's a Boolean value because either you're showing it on the front end or not. So although the shortcode takes in yes or no, they're mostly Boolean. So for these kind of values, we chose to display a toggle button because we could still do them as a simple drop down of a yes or no to choose from, just like the format. But a toggle button is visually more nice. It instantly shows whether that particular feature is on or off. And it's really easy for users to go through these and say, oh, this is on and this is off, and I want this on, but this can stay off. So from the user's point of view, we thought a toggle button would be the best way to do this. But we had a small issue here because the toggle buttons give the output as a true or false. But in our shortcode, we needed the values to be a string value of a yes or a no. So that was the first thing. And the second thing we had an issue with was to add a toggle control to an attribute, it had to be for type Boolean. You can't add a toggle control for a string. It has to be a Boolean. So the single link attribute, which takes the yes or no values, was a string. And so I couldn't add a toggle control to that attribute. So for that reason, I created another variable in the block. This doesn't exist in my shortcode. This only exists in my block. So and created it as a Boolean. And obviously the default was true because the single link default was a yes. And for this, I set the default to be a true. So once for this single link toggle button, now I could add a toggle control in my inspector controls. So then switching it on or off would give me a true or false for that toggle value. And based on the toggle value of true or false, I set the string value for the single link. So if the single link toggle was true, the toggle value was true, the single link attribute was set to a string value of yes. And if that's false, it was set to a string value of no. And when the single link is now passed into my shortcode, the shortcode knows exactly what to do with it. And I had to do this extra step because I was using my shortcode. If I wasn't using my shortcode, I could just take this one toggle value and say either show or hide based on the toggle value. But because we didn't want to change anything in our shortcode, the shortcode needed to be what it is now, because there are many users using the shortcode. So we didn't want to modify the shortcode. So I had to do the extra step in my block so that I could pass the right values into my shortcode. And I had to do the same thing for all of those yes or no op attributes, add an extra toggle attribute, and then set the string value based on the toggle attribute value. It's it's an extra step to do, but the user interface was more important to us. The toggle buttons are much more nice to use than a simple drop down with a yes or no. So we chose to go this route. And next, I want to talk a little bit about the dynamic drop down values that we had to do in our blocks. So in our short code, the business directory listings can be filtered or limited by category or level or membership levels. So they could choose a slug of any category or any membership level, and only businesses from those categories or levels would show up. That was a very nice feature, and many of our users love that feature because they can display multiple they were using the short code on multiple pages and displaying businesses from different categories or membership levels. So this was a very important feature in our short code. So and this takes a slugs of categories or membership levels, and if they wanted to use more than one, they could just add the slugs using separated by commas. And in the short code, that was just, I wouldn't say easy, but that was the best we could do. But in the block, we wanted to give the users options to choose the same thing, to be able to choose one or more categories or the membership levels from a drop down. And again, in the short code, they have to go figure out what the category slugs are and then come back and add it in the short code. Here, we wanted to show them all the existing categories from which they can choose. And this is a lot more user-friendly compared to the short code. And this also obviously had a few challenges for us, because to be able to select more than one option, the attribute needed to be an array. Here, the category is not an array, it's just a string that takes in multiple values. But to be able to display a select drop down where you can select one or more, the attribute that these values go into needs to be an array. So I created a category array attribute just like the toggle attribute, and as a type array, and the default was obviously a null array. Default was an empty array. And the other thing we had to do was display all the categories or custom taxonomies. So the values are going to differ for each site. So I used the REST API to get all the values of the categories or the membership levels, and then display them in the dropdown. And when the values are selected, these are added to the category array. And since it's an array, it can take multiple values at once. So all this was good. Now I needed to take all these categories or membership levels from this array into my shortcode, which needed it inside the category attribute. The shortcode does not have this array attribute, only my block has this array attribute. So for that, inside my PHP callback function, I took all the category array values and put them into the category attribute. And so this made sure all the slugs, selected category slugs, were added to the category attribute as comma separated values. So when the category was passed on to the shortcode, it knew exactly which categories to or membership levels to filter the listings by. Again, similar to the toggle function, this needed an extra step, but I think the output where we could give them the multiple select drop down was really nice. So, and this was probably the only way to do it too. I don't know, maybe there are other ways, but this was the easiest way for me, at least at that point. Then I want to talk about some of the display options we have in our shortcode. This was by far, I think, the most complex part of the block, and also my favorite part of the block because of how nicely I think it turned out. So the display options are the most important too for our shortcode because they give the users ability to display all these different features of the businesses, like I showed you in the business listings image before. They can choose to display or hide all these features: address, URL, social media, categories, membership levels, and so all these are pretty important. So in the short code, similar to the categories and membership levels, the display attribute just takes in all these string values separated by a comma. So pretty straightforward. But in the block, we wanted to make each of these options, display options, into a toggle button. We could have just done a category like multi-select drop down, just like for the categories and membership levels, and it would have been easy too because we know what exactly. We didn't even need to use a REST API. We could just add these as options, but we thought this would displaying them each one as a toggle button would be more user friendly. It's so much easier to see which options are on and which options are off. And again, so we had a few challenges here too. So each toggle button needs its own separate attribute. So here it's in the display, these are just options. They don't have their own attributes in our shortcode. But if we wanted them each in its own toggle button, I had to create a different separate attribute, a toggle Boolean attribute for each of these options. And that was easy. I could create an attribute and add a toggle control for each of these options. But in the end, all of these options, if they're on, they needed to go back into my display attribute for my shortcode, because we weren't modifying the shortcode. We weren't going to add all these options as attributes in our shortcode. Eventually, all these options needed to go back into my display attribute. So to do that, obviously, I have my display attribute from my shortcode as a string, and I have a Boolean attribute for each of my display options. I only show 3 here, but each one has its own toggle button. And so that made it easier for me to add a toggle control for each of my options. And the users can now basically switch it on or off. And if it's on, this gets set as true, and if it's off, this gets set as false. So that was pretty easy to do. And now comes the difficult part of taking all these true or false values and putting them into my display as string values. I can't add these values as true or false in my display. They needed to be a string value. Like if the address toggle is set to true, I need the address string in my display attribute. So to do that, in my PHP callback function, so I created a new array, display options array, and for each of my display options attribute, I checked to see if it was true. I added the corresponding string value to the display options array. So that's what this function does. It takes in the attributes, options, the toggle name, which is the address toggle, URL toggle, and string value, the corresponding string value for each of my display options. So if the display option is true, I add the string value into the display options. And if it's false, it gets deleted from the display options. And then I took all the display options, the array, and imploded the array and used implode to add all the values into my display. So now all string values get added into my display attribute as comma separated values. So they only get added if the toggle is set to true, and if the toggle is set to false, the string value doesn't get added, it gets deleted from the display options. So as and when the toggle buttons are switched on or off, the display attributes gets updated. So when it is eventually passed into the shortcode function, it has only the toggle attributes where it is switched to on. So this required a little bit of going around and building a few extra things, but then the end result was so nice and so easy to use that I just love that feature for our blog. So let's look at the PHP callback function now. So earlier when I talked about the callback function, I only showed the business listings, the business listings. I'm just calling all the directory shortcode and passing all the attributes and storing everything in the business listing. So this is the only part I showed you before. But now, after setting all the attributes, the callback function is pretty big. So here I have all my display options. So for each of my display options, I'm checking the toggle button to see if it's true or false, and then adding my corresponding string value into my display options and eventually putting it into my display attribute. Then I have the category array, which takes in all the one or more selected categories and puts them in my category attribute, and doing the same thing for my membership level attribute. And we also have a membership status in our shortcode, which actually comes from another plugin of ours called the Member Manager. So I had to check if that plugin is active. Only if Member Manager plugin is active, set the status value. Otherwise, the status remains null. So after doing all of that, now I have all my attributes the way I want them to pass into my shortcode. And now I call my shortcode and return the values using the shortcode function. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the new features that we added in our blog. Even though we used our shortcode function, we were still able to add a couple of new features in our blog, which we didn't add in the shortcode. One was the ability to disable pagination. We didn't have that feature in our shortcode, but we thought we'd just add it in our blog. And then the other one is to set a custom font size for the business titles. So when the listings get displayed, the users can now change the title font size. And this was not part of the shortcode, but Gutenberg makes it really easy to add these little things into our blocks. And we also had the option to select an image size for our listings. So the users can choose between a featured image or a logo in their listings. And that's all they could do in our shortcode. But in our blog, we also gave them the option to be able to choose from different image sizes like small, medium, large, and full width. The same sizes that WordPress gives us, default WordPress image sizes. So the default is medium, but they can choose. And adding this, we could have done this in the shortcode, but we never did it. And we added this feature in the blog. And actually adding a few new features in the blog probably would also encourage our users to use the blocks. And eventually, hopefully, they will start using blocks more than the shortcode. So, and we're actually planning to add a few more features in our blog in the future. So even though we were using the shortcode function, we could still add new features in the block which are not part of the shortcode. So that gives us more flexibility in terms of blocks and shortcodes too. And I think that is all I have for today. I just wanted to show you a quick preview of how our block works. So you could just select it using as you would, and then here are my favorite display options. You could just select a few, and then there are the image settings, and the default is a 3-column layout that shows here. And on the front end, they look, the 3 columns look so nice, and all the display options, whatever have been chosen, only those show up on the front end. 4 display options were chosen, and only those show up on the front end. And that's it. Sorry, I didn't mean to play this. And thank you. And you can, if you have questions, I'm ready for them.
Okay, we do have a few questions here. Thank you so much for your talk. Good stuff. Our first question here is, you're using the toggle control to update attributes, but how could that be used with state management like toggle control example in the block editor handbook?
Can you say that again? I didn't quite get it.
Yeah, they're asking, there is an example in the handbook, so in the documentation, to use state management with the toggle control. And I think the question is, how would you do that?
I'm not really sure, because this was my first time doing so much from a shortcode to a block. I just took whatever I needed to, so I'm really not sure how I would use it. I'd have to get back to you on that. Sorry.
No problem. Let's do the next one here. It says, in your example, when creating toggles and dropdowns, how could that be used as a global set of components that all custom blocks should use in the panel without defining attributes in every block? Not sure if that question makes sense to you. A little long there.
It does. And I'm actually currently working on how to do that, because even in our Chamber Dashboard plugins, we have a few of the same components being reused. So I'm actually working on how to do a global set for all our plugins, so that I don't have to keep rewriting them for all my shortcodes. So I still haven't managed to get there, but hopefully by the time I finish converting a few of our blocks, hopefully I'll have some global components. So I can't answer you that yet, because I haven't done it yet, but I'm trying to do that now.